Hi everyone, and welcome to your Snowday lecture on Sergei Eisenstein, D.W. Griffith, and the influence of Charles Dickens. So today what I'm going to try to do is to give you just a little insight into the article that you read, which was written by Sergei Eisenstein, a really famous Soviet filmmaker, about the influence of a Hollywood filmmaker, D.W. Griffith, on his work, and then by implication of Charles Dickens, a novelist's influence on D.W. Griffith. So what you've got is the influence of a 19th century novelist on two 20th century filmmakers, really. So this is for the second slide. One of the things that will help you is to go back and to review the Corrigan Chapter 2 article, Filming Literature, that you read about a month ago that's placed on Blackboard. It covers the same time period as Eisenstein and Griffith were working. So they're working between roughly 1915 and 1960, which is sort of the mid-film era of the 20th century. So the Chapter 2 by Corrigan on sort of the phases of 20th century film reinforces a lot of Eisenstein's ideas, particularly the role D.W. Griffith played in the development of film. D.W. Griffith is really problematic because he does produce one of the most sort of stereotypically racist films of the 20th century, Birth of a Nation in 1915. But Birth of a Nation also establishes some really experimental uses of the camera and does some really interesting things with film that nobody had done before, including expanding the story to a double reel feature length. So it gives you the 90-minute format that you're used to going to the movie theater and paying $20 for today. When before that, films could run 5 minutes, 20 minutes. It just sort of depended, but they tended to be short entertainment features that weren't sort of sit down for a full-length feature. So Griffith really invents that sort of mechanism. He also invents a sort of mechanism to create movie stars, because with this extended feature-length presentation, you start identifying heavily with an actor or actors. Lillian Gish is the most famous movie star to work with him, stars in several of his films. He also uses a lot of editing techniques that are unconventional for the time, like the use of the iris, the sort of darkening circle that focuses you in on one part of the visual field of the film. And these techniques together situate himself thoroughly within the auteurist version of film theory. So Griffith's films are easily identified in terms of his techniques at the time. His techniques also become very influential on later filmmakers like Sergei Eisenstein. So Eisenstein then is writing the article that you read for today very close to both the death of Eisenstein and Griffith. He's writing at the late end of their careers, and he's saying, look, even Soviet filmmaking is influenced by the work of D.W. Griffith and his sort of technical innovations. So that's why these men are so important. Moving on to the third slide, some of Eisenstein's major points in the essay. First of all, that D.W. Griffith's films imitate Charles Dickens' novels. So Charles Dickens is a British novelist of the 19th century. And Eisenstein opens with this quote, "The kettle began it." And that's a quote from Dickens, right? So he's saying in terms of Dickens' verbal style, he starts with a sense of a close-up. He makes you imagine the kettle, and then you move out from the kettle to the plot surrounding the kettle. So Eisenstein is suggesting D.W. Griffith is heavily influenced by this sort of rhetorical move by Griffith, that he is seeing, in a way, his films the same way that Dickens saw his novel. Another thing that Dickens does is creates two parallel actions. So say in one chapter you're following one family, the next chapter you're following another family, and these two families' narratives develop in an intertwined way. D.W. Griffith does the same thing. So you move scenes and you know which family you're looking at. In the case of Birth of a Nation, a northern family and a southern family during the Civil War are following very similar trajectories. And they're cousins. They're related. They're all part of one big American family, but one family's on the northern side of the Civil War, the other family's on the southern. And by cutting back and forth, he creates a sense of parallel action in the narrative that helps the reader sort of identify with the plot. All of this is established through a technique of sort of overlaying film images that Sergei Eisenstein, would become very famous for, known as montage. So the idea that you can edit visual images and create a sense of space and time of progressive movement without any narrative at all gives you the idea of photo montage as a kind of use of photographic words, a way to tell a story with only pictures. And I've added a couple of links to Sergei Eisenstein's film, The Battleship of Potemkin, at the end of this PowerPoint show. So I would like you for Thursday to watch the very famous Odessa Steppe sequence, Battleship Potemkin, and we'll talk about how he uses montage, these visual layers, in order to create a sense of sort of suspense or action. So Eisenstein's main point, one of his main points here, first of all, that Griffith's films imitate Dickens' writing style. Secondly, that film itself borrows largely from stage traditions. Dickens himself was a stage actor, so often Eisenstein is saying, look, Dickens uses sort of visual, performative ways of imagining plot in his novels. And we, as filmmakers, borrow some of these elements. So Dickens himself became very famous as a performer of his works. He would travel around, say, reading from his works. People would buy tickets to come see him read from his works. And one of Eisenstein's other arguments is that this lays the foundation for early film stardom, that Dickens becomes famous as a performer, much like film stars are going to become famous as stars. His third major point, and there are actually several major points you could take from this, but the one we're going to focus on, film takes its topics from literature. So, for example, D.W. Griffith lifts a lot of his first stories from the Bible or well-known novels. Birth of a Nation is actually lifted from a novel called The Klansman, and it is about the rise of the Klan. Like I said, it's very problematic in terms of being horribly racist, but visually innovative. So, for Eisenstein, he's mainly interested in the notion that there is a sort of lineage, a descendant, a parent, in terms of Dickens being the father of the novel, and then Griffith inheriting the sort of storytelling techniques of Dickens, but then putting them on film. And so Eisenstein is comforted by this sort of linear development of narrative from the novel into film. And he attributes his own very famous Soviet montage style to the influence of Griffith in Hollywood, and therefore, if you trace it back, to Dickens. So you have this sort of globalized form of narrative development that Eisenstein is very interested in. So he's saying this American filmmaker was influenced by this British novelist, and I was influenced by them both. Moving on to the next slide, I've got a couple of images here of Eisenstein and Griffith. And just to sort of reinforce the fact that these are two auteurs, right? They are men who produce several films that should be visually identifiable by their style. And they're both very famous, each in their own right. They work very parallel time periods, as you'll see. They die the same year, and they become famous on two separate continents for two different, slightly different styles of film. Again, Eisenstein very heavily associated with montage, and Griffith associated with these sort of technical innovations of editing that create American feature-length films. The next slide talks a little bit about Griffith as an auteur, which we'll talk about more on Thursday, and what he does that's innovative. He's very innovative in terms of reinventing narrative, merging the way you tell stories onto film. He borrows a lot from respectable forms of literature. He starts doing short films based on famous poems, the Bible, short stories, and then novels. And like I said, his real first box office hit, an incredibly influential film at the time, was Birth of a Nation in 1915. And again, it allows for this development of 90-minute reel films rather than just sort of short 10-minute films. So Birth of a Nation becomes very famous for that. Birth of a Nation, however, is also very troubling because it chooses as a sort of American Uber narrative the story of two families, one from the North, one from the South during the Civil War. And it depicts the Klan as sort of riding in to save the day from horrible, marauding Northern soldiers. It follows the Southern family a bit more than the Northern family. But it does have a lot of technical innovations that are important. How it moves the camera, how it captures both epic shots, outdoor, extreme long shots, for example, that show horses running in with soldiers to create a sense of a battle movement. Then an extreme close-up of, say, a family holding a door as they're being attacked to create that sense of suspense or identification with the viewer. Again, at the end of this PowerPoint slide, I've added a link to one of Griffith's clips of Birth of a Nation. I chose a French one in part because you get the least vitriolic comments on Griffith's work if you look at international film sites. Whereas if you look on, you can look on YouTube. These films are public domain, so they're largely available, and they're republished on YouTube, some by incredibly racist groups, and others with incredibly racist comments. So many of the framings of Griffith's work are very troubling these days in terms of pop culture, and how he's used is troubling. But there's no getting around the fact that he invents a lot of these editing techniques that are celebrated today, and in fact, If you look at the editing award, for example, last night at the Academy Awards, that Gravity won a lot of the technical awards. That's because Gravity as a film visually depends on sort of the director's work. That's why you also got Best Director, that it's cut and pasted in such a way, the narrative is woven in such a way that that film tells its story in a very compelling way. Sandra Bullock doesn't win the Oscar for acting, in part because what the Academy was saying is that's a really well-made film. It doesn't really depend on acting. And the same would be true of Griffith's films. They were well crafted. They do develop innovative characters and a recognizable star in Lillian Gish. But character development overall in Griffith is slightly less important than the way it's edited or put together. So for next time, what I'd like you to do is watch this clip of Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin and watch a clip of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, and we'll talk a little bit more about how these two auteurs relate to each other. I would also like you to finish Persepolis, and we'll continue our hot seat presentations on Thursday, talk a little bit about Persepolis, and also talk a little bit about the film festival. I added a lot more information about the upcoming film festival, including links to trailers, on your MU Commons course website. So you might take a look at those and think about how you can help us out with Film Fest, what way you most want to participate. We definitely need people to sit at the dining room table to hand out information on the film festival from 11:30 to 12:30 the week before the film festival. So Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday right after spring break. So that would be one way you can help out too. But I hope all of you will be able to see at least one of the films. They're all good films. So enjoy your snow day, and I will see you on Thursday.